Hello and welcome to some more simplification pattern recognition problems. So when you're trying to improve your pattern recognition in chess, and for beginners who don't even know what that is, basically you want to study or solve chess puzzles, tactics problems, and you'll start to see patterns that recur often in chess. And so you want to go over those puzzles more than once. If you just do a puzzle once, you may forget it and lose the benefit of being able to use that puzzle or that tactic in the future. So if you go over a puzzle or a set of puzzles multiple times, that will help you to remember those problems and tactics more. So I've set this at 500 to 1000 rating level, something a little bit easier. That way it's more about pattern recognition. If the problems were a little more difficult, it would be more about calculation and practicing that. So black has just moved here to defend the rook, which is under attack by the king. So I had a good question by a viewer. How do you know when to simplify down? Well, generally, if you're ahead by a pawn or more of material, that might be a good indicator that you should try and simplify down into a end game with more material. Now, in a rook end game, with just one extra pawn, that may not be enough. A lot of rook endgames can be drawn with that one extra pawn. But the more you practice, the more you'll get a feel for when to trade down. And as your calculation ability gets better as well, you'll know when to trade. So with white to move here, generally you want to look at checks, captures, and threats in that order first. So looking at checks first, the only way to check this king, that should give you the answer right there. So, and you may have seen this problem in a previous video, but that's fine, because as you repeat these patterns, these problems, they'll kind of be burnt into your memory more. So here we go. We're going to capture this pawn, delivering a check, and then that will force the king back, and we'll be able to capture the rook. So now, actually, I should take that back. They can just block, but we'll go ahead by this pawn here. Now, that means we'll be ahead 3 pawns to 2 on the king side, but then over here, black has a pawn majority. So this one might be difficult for beginners to understand, but what we're going to do is capture and then use our pawn majority over here by pushing this pawn. And if they capture, we recapture, and we'll have this passed pawn that we can start pushing up the board, trying to promote it. Black will have to stop that pawn, and while he's doing that, it'll give us time to capture this, move over here and capture this, and then come back over, out of the way of this pawn, which can promote over here. So another thing when it comes to endgames like this, you may have to count the moves. So that can make it a little bit more tricky. So back to when and how to know if you should simplify down. Well, if you're already ahead in material, that's a good indicator. But sometimes if material is even, like it is here, 4 pawns versus 4, well, then there could be other factors, like a passed pawn that will lure the king away, allowing you to pick off these pawns and promote your own. All right, on to the next problem. I'm going to try and do at least 10 problems here. So we have a knight jumping forward, forking queen and bishop at the same time. And now, what can we do here? Well, if we're looking to simplify down, we could just ignore the attack on our queen, go after their queen. But before we decide to do that, and another good thing to check to help you figure out if you should simplify down or not, you want to count up the material. So we have 3 pawns versus 4, so we're behind by a pawn. And also, it looks like we're behind by a knight as well. So that's not so good either. All right. Now, this is where tactics come into play as well. And as you get better and improve in chess, your tactics will improve, and it'll make it easier for you to calculate on how you should exchange down and simplify into a 1 endgame. All right, our queen is under attack, but if we're trying to simplify down, we want to trade off material. We're behind in material, so we have to win some material in this process as well. So if we capture their queen to keep material in their advantage or ahead, they will have to capture our queen. But we have a check available on the next move by capturing this knight, giving check, and the king will have to retreat back because our bishop is preventing the king from moving forward. And then we can pick off their knight and we'll just be ahead in material at that point. So here we go. Capture. Capture with check. And then that allows us to pick off the knight. Now we're ahead this extra bishop. And if our opponent tries to do anything with this pawn, well, it's too late. We're already behind the passed pawn, so it can't move forward and promote. All right, on to the next puzzle here. Let's see. We have a rook coming out of the corner, centralizing a little bit. It's our turn to move. What should we do here? All right, this one's a little bit tricky, but if we're looking to simplify down in material, of course, we have to look for exchanges of material. And before we do that, let's count up the pieces. We have 6 pawns for our opponent, or they have 6 pawns, and we have 7. So we're ahead by 1 pawn, and everything else is equal as far as material. We just have that extra pawn, which is under attack. So, what can we do? We may have to check for any sacrifice possibilities. What if we go here? Capturing the knight. The rook can recapture. Then if our bishop recaptures, we deliver a check to the king. The king can't move. Now remember, when the king is in check, there are 3 options or less. Capture the attacker. So if our bishop ends up here, there's no way to capture that bishop after these exchanges. Block the attacker or run. The king cannot run to get away from the check, so must block, and would most likely block with the bishop. And if that happens, we can capture the bishop, checking the king. The king would have to run The only square possible is here. And that will, so this one's a little more complicated and you have to do a little more calculation in this. So capture the knight with check. Rook captures. Bishop captures with check. Bishop blocks. We capture the bishop with check. Either the queen would have to capture and give itself up, or the king would have to run, and that could leave a potential discovered check. But where would be a good square to go? Well, we could pick off another pawn, I guess. The question is, would we be ahead in material after all that? We're already ahead a pawn. So if we give up our queen for rook and knight, and then we'll gain another bishop, we would go ahead in material. So let's try that. Capture, check, and now the only option is for that bishop to block, and then we would grab the bishop and be with a check and be ahead even more material. All right. Well, on to the next problem here. A rook is pressed forward attacking our queen. What can we do about that? Let's look at material before we start trading pieces down. Okay, we have 7 pawns versus 4. Or excuse me, versus 5. 7 pawns versus 5. So we're ahead by 2 pawns. Okay. So the options are, if we look at checks first, do we capture this pawn, forking the king and the queen? The queen would be forced to capture. Then our rook could capture. We would go ahead another pawn, so that's one easy way to go about it, and maybe that's the only way. So I think that's what I'm going to go with here. And so there we just went up another pawn. So with 3 extra pawns now in this rook endgame, that should be enough to win. And we're about to take the open file with both rooks here. And we can try and get onto the 7th rank with one of our rooks, kind of restricting the mobility of the king and targeting these pawns. Okay, on to the next problem. A knight has just retreated back. If we look at the material, we have 6 pawns versus 6, so it's even. Now, one factor in the position is, we have equal knight and bishop versus knight and bishop, but our knight is better placed on this outpost where it cannot be attacked by a pawn. Only the other knight can chase it away. Also, our pawns are on the light squares, the opposite squares of our bishop. So our bishop has more mobility, whereas our opponent's bishop is blocked in by pawns that are on the same color squares as his bishop. Now, if we're trying to trade down in material, we want to see if there's a way to go ahead in material once we trade down. So pause the video at any time if you need to think longer. If not, let's try this answer here. We could capture the bishop. The knight would recapture, or excuse me, the king would recapture our knight, and then that would allow us to capture this pawn, going up an extra pawn, checking the king, and if the king moves, well then we can capture the knight, the king recaptures, and so white's king would end up all the way over here. And that could give us time to start moving our king up the board. And we have an extra pawn as well. And an all pawn endgame, unless there are doubled pawns, usually that extra pawn is going to help you win the game, unless your opponent is about to promote a pawn of their own, or you have doubled pawns. So if there's a 4 versus 3 majority on one side of the board where you have 4 pawns but they're doubled, well then 3 pawns may be able to hold those 4 back. All right, on to the next problem here. Oh, actually, I guess we need to play this one through. So here we go. Capture the pawn with check. Now we can pick off the knight. The king will have to recapture and end up way over here. So with that, we can move our king up the board. We could even possibly go here to stop our opponent's pawns, kind of block them. One pawn could block 2. But in an endgame with only pawns, it's usually very important to get that king up into the action. So it would probably be better to, once he captures the bishop, we move forward, and then he'll start trying to move back to cut off our king, and we can get up the board here. And, if he goes here, we have this possible option, moving our pawn up, threatening to capture his. If he takes, we could take, and then we would have the opposition. We would have this passed pawn threatening promotion that the king would always have to defend against. All right, hopefully you get the idea. I'll try and do 5 more puzzles here. All right. Queen is retreated back, attacking our queen. So, what can we do here? Let's look at material before we start trading down. We have queen and 2 rooks. We have 3 minor pieces versus 3 minor pieces. And pawns, we have 6. Our opponent only has 5. So we're already ahead in material. So we probably want to start trading down. And we also have an attack on this knight as well. So we could go ahead and capture. Then once the rook recaptures, that'll give us time to take the knight here. But our bishop is under attack. But another issue is that once we take that knight, we'll be attacking their rook up here. So, pause the video if you need to think that out. And when you're doing these puzzles, try to do as much in your head. If you're doing puzzles yourself on a board or in a book or wherever, you want to try and calculate as much as you can in your head. So we're going to take, rook will recapture, then we take the knight and go ahead and material. If they go after our bishop, our rook with their bishop, then that gives us time to take their rook. If they capture our rook first, well then our rook can recapture and get out of the line of fire of that bishop. All right, here we go. Capture. Take the knight, and they just stop there. Because, what are the options? This rook is under attack. It either has to take us, but then our rook can capture, and the bishop would no longer be attacking it. Or, even worse, well, maybe not worse, the bishop could capture our rook, and then that gives us time to take their rook up here. The bishop would then be able to drop back and pick off this pawn, and our knight would be under attack. but we would be ahead in material. All right, 4 more problems to go. A rook has swung over here, attacking our queen. What should we do about that? First, let's look at the material. We have 4 pawns versus their 6 pawns. So we're behind in pawns. So whatever we do, we have to make sure that we end up with an advantage. All right, and I think we can do that if we're looking to simplify down by exchanging off material. And we don't have any good checks, if we're looking at checks first. Now, I was thinking, do we go right away after the rook here? Is there anything better? Do we go after the bishop? Then what? Pawn or queen? Now the queen wouldn't recapture because of our rook lined up there. So if the pawn captured, so bishop captures bishop, pawn captures bishop, then we could take the rook. I think maybe it's better to go this route. Capture the rook. That forces the bishop to capture, to keep material even. Well, to try and go ahead in material, but then we can capture the queen. Rook recaptures, and then we can take the bishop, and we'll just come out ahead in that. So capture the queen, and then that gives us time to take the bishop. We're ahead a bishop for 2 pawns. So that should be enough to win the game. All right, 3 more to go. Knight has just jumped forward here, capturing. What can we do? Well, I would say maybe we go after this knight. Well, before we start looking into trades, let's check the material count. 7 pawns versus 7. Our opponent has gone ahead here with 4 minor pieces versus our 3. So perhaps we recapture with the bishop, pinning the knight to the queen. If the queen goes after this pawn, well, then we'll have time to pick off the knight here. So capture and take the knight. And now, if we look at the material, we're ahead by an extra knight here. And their queen is under attack, so this queen will have to move. All right, well, here we go. The final 2 problems. All right, we're looking to trade down material. And look at the piece count first. 5 pawns for white, 4 for us. Our knight is under attack. The queens are attacking one another, and the rooks are attacking one another. So interesting position here. And this puzzle was in a previous video, so I kind of remember this one. We see that the knight is protecting this rook. So perhaps we can just knock that rook out with our knight. Now the rook is knock the knight out with our knight. The rook is no longer protected here. Then once it is captured by the pawn, Then we can go after the queen. King will recapture, and then we can pick off the rook here. And this is possible because we're capturing with a check. And that's why, another example of why it's so important to look at checks first. So take, now we're simplifying down because we come out ahead with this extra rook here. So this rook, be enough to annihilate the rest of these pawns along with the help from the king, and black can promote his pawn, or not even do that, maybe just bring his king up and try and checkmate with king and rook. All right, we're on to the final problem. Okay, what happened here? Rook has captured a pawn. Now we have 2 pawns versus 5, but we have 2 rooks versus rook and knight. So material wise, we're behind by a pawn. And we're looking to exchange down to simplify material. All right, how should we do that? Oh, okay. Once again, a good example where a key piece here, this knight, is defending the rook. The rooks are attacking one another as well. So, if we knock out the defender of this rook with our other rook and deliver a check at the same time, either pawn or king will have to capture, and that gives us time to pick off their rook. So hopefully you found that one. Capture, and then we're ahead a rook at the end. All right, well, I hope these 10 chess puzzles were fine for you. Let me know in the future. Leave a comment if you would like more difficult puzzles. If these were just right, too hard, not hard enough. Also, if there's anything specific you would like to see in the future, I'll try and work on a video if you have a good request. All right. Well, hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching, and have a super chess day.